What's up, everyone? So today the three questions that we have is grams useful to you? How many employees did you have besides your cousin? And how did you deal with the stress about breaking the law? So the first question was grams useful to me? Not really, no. I didn't. So basically, for you out there that have no clue what grams is, it's a search engine that searches all darknet markets for a given substance or a vendor name or something like that. Even as a buyer, I never really had to use grams because I already knew the vendors that I wanted to do business with. I was on the forums a lot. I was very active in the community, so I knew who I wanted to deal with. I knew who had a good reputation and who had kind of a shady reputation that I wanted to stay away from. So I kind of, I already knew who I was going to do business with, so I really didn't need that. And grams is also good if you want to find, you have a vendor and you want to find all the darknet markets that he's on. A lot of these guys, I already knew. I knew what markets they were on. A lot of them advertise it already in their, the little summary section about them. So, I really didn't use grams at all. The next question was, how many employees did you have besides your cousin? I dealt with one other person who would move stuff locally for me. He would like if I bought weed, I would buy it, and if I was gonna move it locally, here in my state, he would be the guy that I would wholesale it to. But besides that, no. So then the last question was, how did you deal with the stress about breaking the law? So when you're a darknet vendor, or when you're any kind of criminal, really, but especially when you're trafficking narcotics, you need to be okay with it. It's extremely stressful, but at the end of the day, it's a risk that you're accepting. The moment you start doing this, you're accepting the fact that you have that chance of going to prison. And those traditional drug dealers have a much higher percentage of going to prison than the unique new version 2.0 drug traffickers that you'll catch on the darknet. But you're also going to find a lot less darknet vendors in places like prison. You're going to find a lot more of your traditional ones, and I think that speaks volumes to how safe it is. And my whole time in the the institution I was at, I didn't meet any other darknet vendors. Literally none. I met a ton of other drug traffickers, but I didn't meet any other darknet vendors. And I think that's primarily because law enforcement typically just goes for that low-hanging fruit. They're not, contrary to what you see on CSI, that's not the reality of the situation in this world, or in this country. They're very far from all knowing. They're very far from being able to catch every single person. They do actively try. I'm not going to say they don't, but I was really shocked to go through my discovery and see what was in there, because the majority of it was just nonsense. It was an encrypted message printed out, and it's a couple pages of just nonsense, and this is the kind of evidence that they're presenting. Look, he's using encryption, but they didn't even bother to decrypt it. So it was just it was interesting to go through. I thought they would have a lot more, but they didn't. And they don't need to, really, at the end of the day, if they're just going to grab someone and get them to turn. Once they have one person that turns, it's basically a wrap. If you had a criminal conspiracy, I think, where no one talked, and that's just that was the norm, you'd see conviction rates plummet. And I think the majority of your agencies out there, that's what they rely on. They rely on people like informants. I saw a really great episode of Burn Notice one time, and essentially it showed a really good representation of how different federal agencies work. You know, whether it's an intelligence agency or a law enforcement agency, you know, kind of how they work. And one of the things he had said was like, you know, I think it was Sam Axe was like, you know, he was caught and like the bad guys were trying to interrogate him, and he was like, I'm CIA, like, you know, and like when he's the CIA, when he's acting like he's the CIA guy, he's talking to the dude that's next to the guy who's trying to interrogate him, like, oh, you know, you work for us, why don't you just tell him the truth, trying to get, you know, the people that are interrogating him to turn on each other. And then when he acts like he's the DEA agent, he acts like, you know, he seized a bunch of drugs that were coming through customs. And then, you know, when he acts like he's the FBI guy, he talks about, oh, we have an informant in your outfit, you know? And it's really, for me, it really hit home on like how like he kind of nailed it, how all these agencies kind of operate, you know? Obviously the CIA isn't supposed to even operate domestically, but my point was it was really interesting kind of seeing that, you know. I've yet to really see a federal case, especially the FBI, where like someone doesn't tell. I mean, like if no one told, would they even be able to solve crimes? Like I think it's an interesting question to ask, because I don't like them. I think that they just go the easy route. You know, there's a saying, and they say, you know, stupid cops make stupid criminals, and you know, vice versa. And I think, you know, we're at a threshold where, you know, and in some ways, with some things, a lot of criminals that operate nowadays are more intelligent than law enforcement. But obviously, you have the reverse too. You know, you definitely have some law enforcement that's highly intelligent. You know, and then you have other ones that are just willing to do whatever to break a case. You know, including break the law themselves. So, I hope that answers that last question of how did you deal with the stress about breaking the law. You just basically you deal with it, you know. It's a risk you're taking. You know, you need to be cool with it. It's like, you know, if you're going to be a stockbroker, it's going to be stressful, right? And if you don't want that job, you know, go, you know, work at Walmart. You know, I don't know. You find another job that fits you better, that, you know, is more you, that you're more fit for, that you enjoy doing. You know, I think it comes down to that. But like, yeah, that's the biggest thing. And again, like I said in my other video, like I wouldn't, if I go back, I wouldn't change anything, because I was, you know, I did what I felt was necessary at the time. It was definitely the wrong decision. I'll never condone, you know, drug trafficking or anything like that. But I will say that, you know, I don't have any regrets about it, because, you know, the intentionality that I had, there was nothing malicious in it, you know. I could have went a million different ways, you know, and the way I chose was something that was nonviolent, and really kind of like the most passive aggressive form of drug trafficking that you can have. But anyways, thank you guys, and I hope to see you in the next video.